Hello, BookTube, and welcome to our continued read-along of the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, by Stephen R. Donaldson. I'm doing this in conjunction with a couple of other BookTube channels, and we are reading one Thomas Covenant novel a month for the rest of the year to cover the first three books of the first trilogy, the first three books of the second trilogy. We are, by common consent, ignoring the third trilogy. Which a lot of you have asked me about, and I have lots of thoughts on the subject, but I do think it's a good idea. Not only because that trilogy seems a little bit diffused and certainly not anywhere near the dramatic power of the first two trilogies that came out decades before it, but also for the nostalgia factor. Like most of my BookTube co-hosts, I encountered these things in these formats a long time ago when they first came out. I I didn't even notice their hardcover publication if they had it first. I noticed the mass market paperbacks with these classic covers, and there's no association like that with the third trilogy. So maybe later, but right now we're reading these books, and my co-hosts are doing a video a month, but they've allowed me to do a normal read along, uh, where we spend a whole month reading each book. And we're finishing The Power That Preserves, which is the third volume of the first Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. We're finishing this book today, and therefore finishing the first trilogy today. And when you get to a point like that in a read along or a discussion of any kind, I automatically wonder about the usefulness and also about the form of a sort of a recap. I guess I'm sort of assuming by now that anybody who's watching this video has been watching all the others and has been reading along, and maybe doesn't need the whole story of Thomas Covenant. But in very brief form, he is a man from our world. He is a normal human who is a best-selling author. He's married, he has a young son, and he contracts leprosy. Actual honest-to-gosh leprosy. And it causes his wife to leave him and take their son, and it causes him to become an outcast in human society. He learns to make leprosy the central factor of his existence, and to sorry about the stuffed up nose, very sorry, and to put it first ahead of everything else in order to arrest its progress and save himself from the hideous deformities that he's seen at the leprosarium. And in the midst of those sort of manic precautions against the progress of his illness, he suddenly finds himself transported into a fantasy world called the Land. And the Land, when he gets there in Lord Foulsbane, is brimming with health. Roadside berries have the nutritional pick-me-up of a whole meal, and there's a kind of mud called hurtloam that can heal wounds almost instantaneously. And when all of these things combine on Covenant, they start to heal his leprosy. All of a sudden, hands and feet that were numb start to regain feeling. And while Covenant is in the Land, he is drawn to the Land by its enemy, a malevolent being called Lord Foul, who draws him into the Land in large part because Thomas Covenant's wedding band, which he doesn't have the heart to take off even though his wife has left him, is made of white gold. And in our world, that might be a conversation piece for about a minute, but in the Land, it's a source of wild magic, of chaos magic, that is powerful enough to threaten Lord Foul. Whereas the normal defenders of the Land, the wood sorcerers, the stone sorcerers, the much more powerful sorcerers who exist at Revelstone, all of the various peoples that we meet. We meet the Blood Guard, who are ageless, sleepless group of warriors who defend the lords. We meet the giants. All of the people of the Land are not powerful enough to defeat Lord Foul. They hang on by their fingernails whenever he makes war on the Land. And that makes Thomas Covenant, especially his white gold, a key X factor. And yet, right at the beginning of Lord Foul's Bane, the first book in this first trilogy, Lord Foul tells us flat out, as he's telling Thomas Covenant, that you don't know how to use it. You're no danger to me because you might have the white gold ring on your finger, but you don't have any idea how to make use of it. And that stays maddeningly true throughout most of this trilogy. In all of Lord Foul's Bane, Thomas Covenant has no idea how to use this ultimate weapon, that's on his finger. We see Lord Fowl thwarted and temporarily bestalled by other means, by normal heroism. And the same thing is true very much in the Illyrth Stone, the second book in the series, which splits the narrative. We follow Thomas Covenant and a couple of other characters doing one thing, taking a side quest, and the bulk of the book is the normal, conventional war that Lord Fowl is waging on Revelstone. He's marching an enormous army into the land. And this third book also splits the narrative, and we have seen that as we've been reading along. Covenant is summoned to the land again, only this time he's not summoned by Lord Fowl, and he's also not summoned by the lords. He's summoned by a group of individuals working on their own and taking advantage of the general weakening of the magic system of the land to allow them to bring him back, because the land is in desperate plights. Lord Fowl is using something, a big mystical MacGuffin called the Illyrth Stone, to warp even the weather and create this nonstop corrosive winter. Lord Fowl also seems, as our characters figure out fairly early on in this book, he also seems to have control of something called the Staff of Law, which we saw in the Illyrth Stone was a potent weapon against him, an immensely powerful weapon that was in the hands of Elena, the High Lord of the Council at Revelstone, and that was in her hands when she fell at the end of that book in battle with a ghost that she had summoned and that she hoped would save the land. That turned out not to be true, and she falls in battle. And in this book, it becomes obvious that Fowl has that staff. And in the chapters that we're reading today, we see that not only does he have the staff, but he has Elena too. Because when Elena summoned that ghost, that powerful earlier lord in the Illyrth War, she was assuming that he was powerful enough to defeat Lord Fowl easily. That turned out not to be true, but when she summoned that earlier lord, she broke the law of death for the land. It wasn't just the one action that she took. It suddenly means that people can be revived, they can be reanimated, and twisted to the purposes of Lord Fowl. And in the climactic scene in the chapters that we're reading now, Thomas Covenant is, as we've been mentioning all along here, he decides early on in the book that he's simply going to march to Lord Fowl's base at the far east of the land and confront him directly. This is lunacy. Covenant doesn't know how to use his ring. He doesn't have any weapon to fight Lord Fowl. He has no way of knowing that he isn't simply delivering himself to suicide. But he goes anyway. And in the climactic scene of that quest, he is at a cliff with a giant. What you can see, the cover illustration here. There's a knotted tower of stone on the ridge of land that separates the upper land from the lower land. It looks out over Lord Fowl's domain, and it has from time immemorial been a source of mystical power to prevent or stall Fowl from gaining access to the upper land. And Covenant, eventually his quest brings him there, and there he finds Elena, the ghost of Elena, a reanimated body of Elena, who is wielding the Staff of Law, and is entirely in Fowl's servant. She's entirely doing his bidding. In fact, we're told at that point in that scene that even Fowl's customary servants, the Ravers, these three brothers who can possess any living being, would not be trustworthy servants if they were given access to the white gold or to the Staff of Law. They wouldn't be trustworthy. They might turn on Lord Fowl, whereas the command that he has over the beings that he raises from the dead is absolute. And there's a confrontation. And when the Staff of Law touches Thomas Covenant's ring, there's a conflagration, there's an explosion, and suddenly the tables are turned, and the Staff of Law is obliterated, and when it's obliterated, suddenly the dead are no longer raisable, so Elena starts to disappear. She has a wonderful last moment where she tells Covenant to strike a blow for her. Almost makes me like the character. In the Illyrth War, she's a main character, and I never liked her. She seemed to me to be very poorly created by Stephen R. Donaldson, and mainly just one note. And not a healthy note either. A note that crops up all through the first trilogy and isn't very healthy. But we can get into that. But when that happens, we are not totally surprised as readers. Because, keep in mind, this parallel storyline with Covenant just marching to Lord Foul's stronghold is happening at the same time as the conventional warfare episodes that we talked about last time, the Siege of Revelstoke. They're happening at the same time, just like the parallel events at the end of the Illyrth War were happening at the same time. So we already know a couple of things that are going to happen. We don't know the details, but we know they're going to happen. We know that Covenant is temporarily going to lose his ring, that Lord Foul is seemingly going to temporarily have possession of it. We know that Covenant's going to get it back, and we know that Covenant is going to strike a blow, a victory. And sure enough, when he destroys the Staff of Law, which Elena had been using at Foul's behest to create this unnatural winter, the unnatural winter stops. We've already seen it stop in the great chapter earlier that we talked about last week, called Lord Morham's Victory. So we already know that. It's not a complete surprise, but what takes place from there is totally unknown to us, which is that Covenant and the giant Saltheart Foamfollower, the only giant left in the land, make their way to Lord Foul's stronghold. They encounter a tragic race of mud beings. The Jaharan are a race of cast-offs that have one of the most striking and heartbreaking origin stories of any race in a fantasy novel that I've ever read. They are the broken and misapplied trial runs of Foul's attempts to successfully create supernatural beings who will serve him. So he's constantly doing that. Think of the scene in Peter Jackson's The Two Towers where Saruman is literally birthing one of his Harukai, one of his superior orcs. Think of something like that. Only think that for every one of those successful births, there are plenty that don't work, that Lord Foul just makes. The process doesn't work. And instead of destroying these semi-living, semi-sentient creatures, he just casts them out into the vast magma swamps around his stronghold. And it turns out that they are sentient and that they don't partake of his evil. And Foamfollower and Covenant meet them and get a lot of useful advice on how to wind their way directly into Foul's stronghold, where there is a confrontation. And the confrontation boils down to one between Covenant and Lord Foul. This is what we've been building to in the course of this trilogy. And Covenant still doesn't know how to use his ring, but he does know from what he has seen in previous books and also earlier in this book when the Staff of Law touched his ring. He does know. He might not know how to use the ring, but he knows what's likely to happen if the ring comes into contact with the Illyrth stone itself. And he's pretty sure that Lord Foul knows that too. They have a long and tense disagreement. They confront each other. There at the heart of Foul's power, Covenant suddenly seems able to use his ring. And so they have a massive sorcerous conflict between the two of them. But they also have a conflict of ideas. And there is a fascinating moment here that resolves a lot of issues surrounding Thomas Covenant, who has always fought with the idea that the land itself must be a dream, that the whole thing must be a hallucination. That is the fundamental training of what I mentioned, his fundamental training in dealing with his leprosy, is that it must be the central reality of his life. And in the central reality of our world, nerves don't regenerate. There is no cure for leprosy. You can't revive dead nerves. So if he suddenly finds himself in a fantasy land where everyone is incredibly healthy and where it's possible for lepers to heal, he naturally thinks that it's a fantasy, that he's unconscious. In this particular case, in every one of these first three books, there is an inciting incident in our world that seems to make him go unconscious. So in every time he wakes up in the land, he is at least partially justified in thinking none of this is real. But he's come to love the place, and he's come to love the people in it, including his own daughter, Elena, and also all of his friends, like Foamfollower, like the Bloodguard who is charged with his protection, like some of the lords, like Lord Morham, that we met in detail last time. And Foul taunts him with that by telling him, do you yet believe that this is a dream? And Covenant says, it isn't real, but that doesn't matter. That's not important. What is then? Foul asks him. The land. You. Once more the despiser laughed, but his mirth was short and vicious now, He sounded disturbed, as if there was something in Covenant where he could not, which he could not understand. The land and unbelief, he jeered. You poor deranged soul, you cannot have both. They preclude each other. But Covenant knew better. After all that he had been through, he knew better. Only by affirming them both, accepting both poles of the contradiction, keeping them both whole, balanced, only by steering himself not between them but with them, could he preserve them both, preserve both the land and himself. Find the place where the parallel lines of his impossible dilemma met, the eye of the paradox. My argument would be that we've waited a long time, that maturation in Covenant has been a long time coming. It feels natural when we get to it. He's found a way to balance the two things. I think that it's not made terribly explicit in this confrontation scene, but I think that balance, once it comes to the test, once it's actually pressured by Lord Fowl, is a key reason why the ring seems more amenable to his control. Because as Lord Morham told him earlier in the book, you are the white gold. It's not a ring, it's you. One way or another, there is a climactic battle, and again, I'm assuming that if you're watching this video, you've been following all along, and that this is not going to ruin the ending for you, because I want to talk about the ending just a bit, in specific. And specifically because we're moving on from this book. We're not stopping just because this is the end of the trilogy. We have another trilogy to read. At the end of this book, Covenant seems victorious. He has Lord Fowl beaten, stripped of the penumbra of energy that usually surrounds him, stripped even of his maturity, rapidly degenerating to a state of complete helplessness. And suddenly Covenant finds himself surrounded by all the old lords who've gone before him. All of the great figures from the land's mythology, from its great history, and all saying the same thing: kill him. Kill him while you have him weak. Destroy him. And in one of the book's most disappointing moments for me, Covenant refuses. And gives, believe it or not, a tired excuse. He gives a tired variation on that silly Hollywood thing of, if I kill him, I'm no better than he is. I don't know when people are going to get tired of hearing nonsense like that. Lord Fowl, his name is Fowl. All he does is pervert and destroy. He has no positive side. There is no downside to killing him. There is only positive side. And not only that, but Covenant is the kind of person who would have no patience with that kind of a nostrum. He would do what needs to be done, but no, he doesn't. He doesn't. But he does cause a huge conflagration there at Fowl's headquarters that starts to rip apart the land itself, and that in the process kills Saltheart Foamfollower, who had been there all along, who had been his friend from the beginning. And that breaks the spell binding Covenant to the land. In these books, when the summoner dies, the person they summon disappears, usually, except for extraordinary circumstances. And in this case, that happens. Covenant begins to vanish from the land. There is another supernatural being. The counterpart to Lord Fowl is the Creator, and he is grateful for everything that Covenant has done and offers him a couple of favors. You know, can I show you my kindness in some way or other? One of the ways, Covenant refuses, in a way that by the end of that scene, by the very end of this book, so it took a long time, I found myself actually starting to like Covenant, despite all of the obnoxious stuff about him that we've seen in the course of this read-along. And so I expected him to refuse, and reading it again, I like that scene even more, that moment even more. The harsh, completely normal words that he uses in this high fantasy setting reminded me a lot of Roger Zelazny, who often did the same thing. And the creator, one of the creator's gifts is to show Covenant visually the battered remnant of the defenders of the land at Revelstone, which he has not, in this book, he doesn't have any connection with them at all. The plot lines are completely separate. He gets to see them, gets to see that they're alive and that they're battered, but they are determined to go on, to forge a new life in the land. And the one other gift that the creator gives to Covenant reflects on what I mentioned about how there's always a series of injuries that Covenant undergoes in our world that are severe and that we know he's going to have to duplicate in the land If you see what I mean, like if he's in our world and he gets a cut on his forehead and he goes to the land suddenly and he still has the cut on his forehead, but it starts to heal because he's there for weeks or months, we know that in order to preserve the self-contained nature of the land, which could, after all of this, be an illusion, he has to sustain an injury to his forehead immediately before he goes back home. In this case, Covenant is sick. His leprosy is out of control. He's starving. He's weak and cut up all over. In this case, the injuries that Covenant endured in our world before being taken to the land were life-threatening. And the Creator offers him a pass. I will save you. I will save you in your world. So the end of the book finds Covenant in a hospital bed. And once again, it's a very brief scene. We get a couple of doctors, a couple of nurses, and once again, all of that stuff in our world is very brief, but very well done. Donaldson writes our world really well. A conventional novel by him would be something I'd be very interested in reading. But to the best of my knowledge, he never did one, at least under his own name. And we leave Thomas Covenant happy to be alive, remembering everything, and happy to be alive. And that ends this trilogy. And you're barely going to get a moment's rest before we move on, because next weekend, for the month of October, we are reading the next book, which is the first book in the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever, called The Wounded Land. Again, this is the old mass market covers. I found a set on Amazon. I found that I didn't have any of these, so I found a set on Amazon. The Amazon seller said they're all in really good condition. They're only minorly scuffed, and it's a box set. So I will send you the box. And it was dirt cheap, so I ordered it, and it came, and there was no box. It's just 3 books. And I went to Amazon. They send you that reminder email saying, would you care to rate your purchase with X, Y, or Z? And when the email prompt came up for this purchase, I went to the seller's site, and I wrote the book's condition were exactly as he described. The one negative experience I had with the transaction is that the seller is a liar. He repeats 3 times in his ad, in his posting for the book, that this is a box set, knowing perfectly well that he was not selling me a box set at all. And Amazon didn't allow it. They didn't allow that review. They don't want any negatives like that. But anyway, we are now done with the first Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever. So part 1 is that I want to hear everything you had to think about it, especially if this is your first time reading this trilogy, but also a lot of you old-timers who are rereading it for the first time maybe in years. I know that a lot of you are in that position. What did you make of it all? What did you make of the big climax at the very end of the book, involving laughter? It struck me as incredibly forced when I first read the book. I liked it a little bit better this time, but now we're moving on. We're moving on to in October. We will be reading The Wounded Land, and it's a bit of a downer. I should warn you ahead of time. It's a bit of a grim book until the final quarter of the book. It's pretty grim, and we'll get into why next week. But this book has 27 chapters plus a long what has gone before and a map and all that. So I'm going to round that up to 28 and say that we will read 7 chapters a week. For the month of October. So that means we will go from the chapter called Daughter all the way to the chapter called Married for next week. So we'll be beginning The Wounded Land next week, having finished The Power That Preserves. So we are slowly working our way through the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. So let me know what you made of all this, and we'll reconvene next weekend and begin The Wounded Land and see. I know this trilogy a lot less well than I know the first one, so this reread will be a lot of fun for me, and maybe cause some of my opinions to change. So we'll reconnect next weekend. Thank you, Book 2.